Christian, is your determination to follow Christ radical? Radical is an interesting word. Sounds like radish because it's a root. That literally means to the roots or from the root. Is it kind of a side thing, or is it at the root you're a Christian? Radical. And many have described Jesus' call to his disciples as a radical call. It's a demanding call on his disciples to put Christ first over all else. Is Christ in your life in general, or is he supreme? Is he preeminent? Does he come first, unquestioningly first? Now, I think to be a Christian in any meaningful sense means that it takes sacrifice to put Christ first. It's not easy to put Christ first because that means you have to reorder things constantly so that he's first and that other thing takes second, third, fourth place. The Christian reorganizes the week to prioritize gathering with a local fellowship every Sunday. The Christian gives generously to the Lord's work through giving to the church. The Christian learns a bunch of disciplines and habits and attitudes, things that we're supposed to grow into more and more. And then at the same time, Christians also learn things not to do, things that displease the Lord. And so we sacrifice by determining to not do those things and do the things we're supposed to do, which is a constant battle. But there are times where certain challenges will arise in your life that make those kinds of, they already feel like sacrifices, but when that challenge arises, you'll be really put to the test whether you really put Christ first in those kinds of ways. Commitments that kind of seemed easy-ish in one phase of life, and another phase of life might be really hard to stick to. Just how focused should our priority of Christ and his kingdom be? And I know we know the answer. We know the Sunday school answer. It's like first importance. That's easy to say on a Sunday morning at church. It's easy to, if you're given a theology quiz, it's easy to check that box. Well, first, what are you going to do? Put Jesus second? You know that's not the box you're supposed to check. But it's in the day-to-day life. It's when you're challenged to make little compromise here, little compromise there, and we don't have to be radical. Radical kind of sounds like a bad term now. You might hear people being mocked for being right-wing radicals. Or on the other hand, you might go, he's a radical liberal. I prefer old school liberal. These guys are radical. Radical is, it sounds like, radical equals crazy, unhinged, nutso. Nobody wants to be radical. We have a relationship with Christ, we might go. It's a relationship. Radical is like for religious people. Religious radicals, they tend to be cults. They're radical, and that's what makes them a part of a cult. No, what makes them part of a cult is false doctrine. Being radical about something that's false. We're supposed to be radical about something that's true. And if Christ truly is supposed to be first, that sounds pretty radical, doesn't it? Are you an extremist if you put Christ extremely first? Well, I just think you're following Christ's call to be a disciple that puts him above all else, not above most things, above all things. So Christ should be our greatest point of excitement. It should be what we want the most. His kingdom is what we should be longing for the most with the greatest intensity in our lives. It's what we should be desiring above all other things. And we get an example of this in 2 Samuel 18, the second half of 18, and then going into 19, where David receives the news that his son Absalom, who rebelled against him, has been killed. You'll recall that David wanted to go out to face Absalom personally. Now, if you're new here, or if you haven't been tracking with us, Absalom is David's son who has been quite disappointed in David. In fact, he pretty much hates David. He wants David dead. And so he gathered people to himself, and when he got enough of them, he launched a coup to take over the kingdom, and David and his guys that are close to him, they went on the run. Absalom is in charge. He's on the throne. He's got David's concubines. It's a mess. And now Absalom is going to go march out to kill David, and David's soldiers are going out to face him, and they left David behind. David wanted to go with them, and they left David behind, like, no, you stay here. You're too important. But wink, wink, it's probably because he's going to go out and want to protect Absalom. He's like, please, deal mercifully with Absalom. Please, don't kill Absalom. Be gentle with Absalom. That's why they don't want him there in the field. You stay back, because Absalom gets caught in a tree. We looked at that last week. And Joab and his soldiers under his command execute Absalom. So Absalom is dead. David doesn't have the news yet. And in this passage, David is about to receive the news that Absalom is dead. Is he going to be excited about that? Well, we meet this character. We've met him before, Ahimaaz, who's really, really excited about it. And so you see tension in the text. Joab is like, someone's going to have to report this to David. Ahimaaz is like, ooh, I'll go. Joab's like, don't you remember? He's killed messengers before. Remember the guy that came and said, hey, Saul asked me to murder him, and because he was in pain and he was bleeding out. He wasn't going to make it anyway, so I killed him. He's like, you dare touch the Lord's anointed? And killed him right on the spot. He's done that a couple of times. Are you nuts? You want to go and deliver to David the news that his own son is dead? Nah. Please, I really want to go. It's strange. So this is why I introed the sermon the way I did. You've got Ahimaaz that looks like he's got misplaced excitement. And then you've got David who looks like his grief makes a lot of sense, especially if you have children. Whatever they were into, whatever they did, you're not going to rejoice that they're dead. So it seems like David's emotions are rightly placed, and Ahimaaz's emotions are like a little bit off, dude. But as you read the story in the context, it actually is the opposite. And that's what's difficult. Let's look at it together. Ahimaaz, as you're going to see now, he doesn't see the news as David's son is dead. He sees the news as the enemy of the Lord's anointed is dead. And it's great news to him. We get the land back. We get the people back. We've got proximity to the ark back. The rightfully anointed king sits on his rightful throne again. So this is what he's excited about. And that's his focus. So he's excited about it. He just has to be the first person to deliver the news to David. But Joab is concerned because he knows David is not going to share that excitement. And as we read it, we go, should he share that excitement? His son is dead. His priority is that his son has been killed. It's his son we're talking about. So let's look at 18:19 through 33, where Ahimaaz is excited to deliver this good news to David, who's unlikely to receive it as good news. Then Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, said, let me run and carry news to the king that the Lord has delivered him from the hand of his enemies. He's probably smiling when he says that. And Joab said to him, you are not to carry news today. You may carry news another day, but today you shall carry no news because the king's son is dead. Dummy. That's my insertion, obviously, if you're following along. Then Joab said to the Cushite, go tell the king what you have seen. The Cushite bowed before Joab and ran. So the Cushite is a non-Israelite servant to Joab who is not important enough to protect. Let's just be honest, okay? He's sending Cushite, he thinks probably to his death. But someone's got to deliver the news. Let's have someone who's on the lowest rung of the ladder go deliver the news. He tells the Cushite, go tell the king what you have seen. The Cushite bowed before Joab and ran. Now, some commentaries say the Cushite probably didn't know the background, didn't know the story. I'm like, I don't know. Sounds like he's just obeying to me. We don't know what he knows. He's just going to go run and deliver the news. Verse 22, Then Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, said again to Joab, come what may, let me also run after the Cushite. In other words, however David responds, the literal Hebrew just says, whatever. Let me just go. Let me run after the Cushite. And Joab said, why will you run, my son, seeing that you will have no reward for the news? This is not you're not going to be greeted well here with this news. Come what may, he said, I will run. So he said to him, run. Then Ahimaaz ran, not behind the Cushite. He ran by way of the plain and outran the Cushite. Is he faster than the Cushite? No, he took a different route, a flat route. So the Cushite's climbing and, going up and going down and going up and going down. It's through some difficult terrain because it's the shorter route, but it's an arduous route. This guy takes a longer route, but it's flatter, and he wins the race. Verse 24, now David was sitting between the two gates, and the watchman went up to the roof of the gate by the wall, and when he lifted up his eyes and looked, he saw a man running alone. The watchman called out and told the king, and the king said, if he is alone, there is news in his mouth. In other words, this isn't everybody coming home. This is a messenger. He's got something to tell me. Okay, he desperately wants to know what the message is. And he drew nearer and nearer. The watchman saw another man running, and the watchman called to the gate and said, see, another man running alone. The king said, he also brings news. The watchman said, I think the running of the first is like the running of Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok. He must have had an interesting stride. I don't know if that probably didn't have binoculars back then, but he's just looking out there, and he's like the silhouette of a guy. He runs with that weird step like Ahimaaz. I don't know. But somehow he recognizes him. And the king said, oh, he's a good man, and he comes with good news. Then Ahimaaz cried out to the king, all is well. Really? He bowed before the king with his face to the earth and said, blessed be the Lord your God, who has delivered up the men who raised their hand against my lord the king. Notice how he puts it in terms of God. This is news about God. This is news about the Lord and the king that the Lord has anointed. This isn't about David. This is why Ahimaaz is excited about it. Because actually, what comes first to him above all things, like he's expecting David to view it, is that the Lord's anointed had an enemy, and that enemy has been defeated. That's why he's excited. That's why he's smiling. That's why he says, all is well. Blessed be the Lord your God. What did God do? He delivered up the men who raised their hand against my lord the king. And the king said, basically, never mind all that. Is it well with the young man Absalom? That's all I care about. Not how many troops have we lost? What did it cost? How close was it? You're right. Amen. Amen. Blessed be the Lord. He is a deliverer. Yeah. What about Absalom? Now here, I don't know what Ahimaaz is thinking. Joab told him this was going to be the conversation, and he just kind of chickens out. Ahimaaz answered, when Joab sent the king's servant, your servant, not that I begged him to go, Joab just sent me, When Joab sent the king's servant, your servant, he's talking about himself, I saw a great commotion, but I do not know what it was. You liar. So now he's going to let the Cushite tell that part. And the king said, turn aside and stand there. Wait there a minute. Ooh, I wouldn't like that, but turn aside, stand there. So he turned aside and stood still. And behold, the Cushite came. And the Cushite said, good news for my lord the king. For the Lord has delivered you this day from the hand of all who rose up against you. Very similar focus, very similar theology built into that statement. The king said to the Cushite, is it well with the young man Absalom? And the Cushite answered, may the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise up against you for evil be like that young man. Not a dummy. He doesn't quite go, oh yeah, slaughtered, dude. Hanging from a tree, impaled with numerous javelins, cut down. and then buried under a heap of stones, like Achan from Joshua 7. He's a cursed man. He doesn't want to say all that, but he also is not going to lie, and there's no third messenger to push it off on. He's the guy. He's probably looking at the guy that beat him there like, you jerk. You gave him half the news. Here's how he puts it. He puts it in terms of enemies against the Lord the King. May the enemies of my Lord the King and all who rise up against you for evil. He doesn't say the word Absalom or your son, but he puts it in terms of, he kind of backs out of it, makes it less personal and more kingdom oriented. Like, however he related to you personally or in your mind, he rose up for evil. His agenda was evil. He was evil. And he's been put down. And may everyone, whether they're related to you or not related to you, may everyone who rises up against you for evil be put down like he was put down. So he's trying to back out and go, this is how it's supposed to go, David. And it should be good news. Verse 33, and the king was deeply moved. Doesn't kill anybody, doesn't execute anybody, but he is, although the messengers are not killed, David is killed in a sense. He was deeply moved and went up to the chamber over the gate and wept. And as he went, he said, oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would I had died instead of you, O Absalom, my son, my son. So he's just not kind of weeping. He's just saying this over and over. People overhear him. He's in the deepest grief. Now, the problem here is not that David should have been excited about Absalom's death. It's not that he should have greeted that and like, yes, thank you for that news. It's such great news that my son is dead. I'm glad my son is dead. I don't think the text is teaching us that he should have clicked his heels about the news that Absalom was dead. But David's behavior betrays the fact that Absalom is more important to him than the kingdom. That's the problem. Absalom is a priority for David, as any child should be a priority for any parent. That's not the problem. The problem is not his grief. The problem is the extremity of his grief. The problem is how his grief outweighs the joyous news that the kingdom has been delivered. It was about to get taken over. And we see that continue in the following verses as Joab can't take it anymore and rebukes David to his face for his grief. Seems a little cold at first, considering that this is David's son, but it's also kind of weird. We didn't see this grief for Amnon. We didn't see this grief for Tamar when she was violated. But let's look at Joab's response, 19:1-8. And that'll be our text for today. It was told Joab, behold, the king is weeping and mourning for Absalom. So the victory that day was turned into mourning for all the people. For the people heard that day, the king is grieving for his son. And the people stole into the city that day. It's a weird phrase. We'll unpack it in a minute. And the people stole into the city that day as people steal in who are ashamed when they flee in battle. The king covered his face, and the king cried with a loud voice, oh, my son, Absalom, oh, Absalom, my son, just over and over. Verse 5, then Joab came into the house to the king and said, you have today covered with shame the faces of all your servants who have this day saved your life and the lives of your sons and your daughters and the lives of your wives and your concubines, because you love those who hate you and hate those who love you. For you have made it clear today that commanders and servants are nothing to you. For today I know that if Absalom were alive and all of us were dead, then you would be pleased. Now therefore arise, go out and speak kindly to your servants. For I swear by the Lord, if you do not go, not a man will stay with you this night. And this will be worse for you than all the evil that has come upon you from your youth until now. Then the king arose and took his seat in the gate, and the people were all told, behold, the king is sitting in the gate. Before they were told, he's grieving, he's grieving. Where is he? He's grieving. Well, now they're told, hey, he's sitting in the gate. And all the people came before the king. So let's just make a few observations really quickly. David wasn't just sad that Absalom was gone. David put Absalom ahead of the Lord and ahead of the Lord's kingdom. And here's how we know that's true. 5 observations from the passage to know that it's not just general grief about Absalom, but prioritizing Absalom above the Lord and his kingdom. The first observation, 5 observations real quick. The first one's in verse 2. In verse 2, we see that the victory that day should have been a day of victory. It should have been a day of celebration. It should have been a day of dancing in the streets. David's done that before. Instead, it was turned into a day of mourning, a day of grief. You're not supposed to celebrate. You're supposed to be sad and cry and mourn. No dancing, no celebration. So he reverses the victory day. Instead of having a V-day, he has a day of grief. Second observation is this sort of grief that's forced upon the people by David's agony. If the king is grieving like this, you guys better fall in line and agonize over this as well. It completely changed the mood, and it didn't match the occasion. So that's how we get that weird verse in verse 3. People stole into the city like people steal when they flee in battle. So imagine these people went out in battle, and rather than courageously fighting, they chickened out and retreated. And now they've got to come back into the city and face the king with shame, right? How'd the battle go? Sorry, we chickened out. What? That's the same attitude with which they came back into the city. Rather than, hey, we won, it's like, oh, somehow we lost. And we lost with shame. It just was completely reversed. It was strange to everybody. Third observation is verse 4. David is completely beside himself. He's covering his face. He's crying with a loud voice. If you're walking by, you can hear it through the open window. Oh, my son, Absalom, my son, Absalom, my son, my son. Repeating what we got in verse 33. He's just saying it over and over. My son, my son, my son. He's completely gone. He's not organizing the troops. He's not talking about how we're going to move back in. He's not talking about how we're going to reclaim the kingdom, the throne. He's only wailing about Absalom. Observation number 4. The last time we heard these words, back in verse 33 of the previous chapter, he says the same thing, but he adds, I wish I would have died instead of you, O Absalom, my son. What are you saying there, David? God anointed you to be king. This isn't about you, and you don't get to choose to unking yourself for the sake of an evil rebel. But in David's mind, the first thing in his mind is, that's my son. He's my son. Nothing challenges my devotion to my son. Well, it should. You are God's anointed king over these people. That has to come first. And David is grief-stricken to the point not just that he wishes Absalom lived, but that if he had to, the only way to make Absalom live was for him to die, he would do it. He'd take that deal. Wait a minute, David. If that were true, then Absalom would be the evil king reigning over God's people, and God's choice to reign over his people is dead. I don't care, it's Absalom. He's just gone. Fifth and last observation here. He's covered his own people with shame. This is what Joab tells him in verse 5. You've covered them. You've covered your people's faces with shame. Why? You've covered them with shame. David covered them with shame because they risked their own lives to save David. They risked their lives to save David, and he doesn't care. He'd rather all of them die as long as Absalom's alive. They're full of shame because David has other family too. He has other family. It's not just Absalom. He has other sons, other daughters, wives, concubines, and the soldiers risked their lives to save those family members too, and they did, and he doesn't care. He's just focused on Absalom. Shame because those who show sacrificial love for David, David pays no attention to. He's not going out to talk to them. There's no thank you. There's no gratitude. There's no celebration. He acts like he hates them, Joab says. Shame because those who actually hate David and try to kill David, Absalom, David loves and wishes he lived. Shame because, what Joab tells him, if those who love you and would die for you did die, and the one who hates you and wants to kill you lived, you wouldn't be weeping at all. You'd be pleased. You've got this completely backwards, David. I don't care how much you love Absalom. You're putting him ahead of what needs to be your first love and your first priority. That's the problem. So Joab warns David that he has to reverse course or else the whole kingdom's going to be lost to you, man. Not one person is going to stand with you if you don't change this. Go out and talk to the people, show them appreciation, wash your face, stop mourning, and get back on the throne. Well, to David's credit, by the Lord's grace, things turn around. He needed that sort of slap in the face. He gets the correction that he needs to course correct. And David changes. He receives that rebuke before it was too late, before things really derailed on him. And I hope that we allow this passage to course correct us if we need it. And I think we all need it from time to time. Now, here's the benefit of this passage to us. David is wrong, not for loving his son. He's wrong for putting familial loyalty over divine loyalty. He's not wrong for having familial loyalty. He's wrong for putting it ahead of his loyalty to the Lord. David's allegiance to the throne, it's not allegiance to himself even though he's the king. It's not that he put Absalom ahead of himself. It's not about himself. His allegiance to the throne is not allegiance to himself, David. It's allegiance to Yahweh, because really it's Yahweh's throne, and you're sitting there as God's representative, anointed representative. David knows this. This is why he didn't lay a hand on Saul. You remember that? A couple of opportunities to kill Saul, and he refused to touch Saul. Not because Saul's such a great guy, but because that's the Lord's anointed. Well, guess what? Now you're the Lord's anointed, and you're acting like you'd rather Absalom live and you die. That's crazy. David was zealous to keep kingdom matters of first importance for the most part. But this was his son. Oh, my son, Absalom. Familial loyalty challenged his divine loyalty. And CFC, we need to prioritize our loyalty to Christ over every other loyalty, even our deepest loyalties, like our own children. I don't want you to ever take from what I'm saying here that you should love your children less. I'm just saying we need to love Christ more. With the intensity that you feel that love for your children, it's not to dial it down a notch. It's to make sure that your loyalty to Christ is even more and that it comes first. Now, for many Christians, we have a real zeal for the Lord, but man, when our children are born, there's the challenge. And when I talked about challenges in the beginning, maybe you thought about job loss, maybe you thought about cancer, negative things in your life. Oftentimes, it's the positive things in your life that most challenge what's first in your life. If you have had the privilege to have your own children, you hold that baby in your arms, maybe the first time, your first child, and you kiss their forehead and you smell that unique baby smell. It's so strange that God created us in his own image and then decides to picture it and how this little tiny human being looks like you to help us understand God's fatherhood a little more. It's deep. And there's a God-designed, built-in instinct to care for this child with the fiercest of loyalties. And that's good. God designed that. But you're not loving your son the best unless you love Jesus the best. Your daughter is not getting the love from you that she should have unless you love Christ more than her. We owe our children loyalty, but we don't owe them ultimate loyalty. So how might that conflict in our lives? What can we look ahead down the road as we're raising children? Well, when that child doesn't want to go to church, and when they're real little, they maybe demonstrate that by throwing a fit, or when they hit their teenage years, they roll their eyes or slam the door. You might be tempted to try to find a church that's more exciting for the youth. I know it's immature, but it's what the kids want. And churches are tripping over themselves to provide, some of them, separate church services. The whole church service is in the gym for the youth. The whole thing is separate for them, for the teens. And let's do the songs that are exciting. And let's open up with some jokes and be really funny. And let's dress cool up here, even if it might be slightly immodest. And then those children become adults. Do you think they suddenly walk over from the gym and come to stuffy, fuddy-duddy church? Hymns and no, let's keep that going. Let's just do the young adult version of it. And this is where you get so many churches where the entire service feels like it's built for the immature child, because it is. We resist that temptation, and we don't go to church that our kids can be excited about. We go to churches that give us the oxygen we need to breathe well so that we can, in turn, give them the oxygen they need. Every time, I've mentioned this many times, every time you're sitting on a plane, you're getting ready for your flight, and they walk you through the same old thing they've walked you through for the past however many decades. They tell you if, in an emergency, oxygen masks drop down from the ceiling above you, and you're with someone who can't help themselves, put your oxygen mask on first, then apply an oxygen mask to the person sitting next to you that needs help. It's the same principle. What your kids need is for you to be at your best so that you can help them, not surrender to all their immature ideas of what church should be. Of course it's going to feel boring many times because they're kids. Unless you're the parent that goes, I know you don't like veggies, here's Fruit Loops again. Do you do that, or do you go, no, you got to eat some veggies now? Well, it's the same thing. We've got to go to a church that's healthy. CFC is by far not the only place, but it's an example of one, I think. Or maybe the child's a little older and the child wants to join a sport. But you look at the schedule, you talk to the coaches, you find out that that sport is going to compromise Sunday mornings. What's that conversation look like? Well, I got to put my kid in sport. How can we have a sportless kid? How does that conversation go? Are you ready for that conversation? When that child gets older and starts dating and brings home an unbeliever, or maybe a super weak believer, how's that conversation go? Is our standard, as long as they're not doing drugs, and as long as nobody's pregnant, we're okay? Or do you want your best for the child? How does that conversation go? Are you ready to have that conversation? If that child does get into drugs or drinking or sexual deviance, how does that conversation go? I've heard more than once parents go, well, we allow it in the house because I'd rather it in the house than some frat house, you know? It's scary out there. At least, so you allow it to go on in your own basement? Grow up. Your kids need a parent, not a best friend, not an enabler. We're so tempted to put our kids' ideas and wants first. We don't want to lose them. They might run away. I tell you, This is not in my notes. It's better for your child to run away than for you to put them ahead of Christ. I hope they don't run away. But we need to stop operating in fear that our children will love us less. Our first question needs to be, what does Christ want? And if Christ is king in my household, what does he want? And what does that look like? And the kids need to conform to that. Now, they might, as adults, walk away from all of it. But then that's on them. For parents, learning this priority might be as simple as learning how to tell your child no from the earliest age. And that no means what? No. If it's no the first 3 times and then the 4th time they get a yes, guess what they just learned? All you have to do is badger mom a little bit and you'll get the thing you want. But God doesn't operate like that, and so we're misrepresenting God when we do that. And then we start little by little putting them first. They determine what they eat. They determine what church to go to. They determine the schedule. And then we start losing the little representation of God's kingdom, which is the house. And for all parents, this means modeling what we say, not just saying we have to do this and saying we have to do that, but showing our children that we follow Christ this way. We, mom and dad, we take this seriously. But this isn't just about children. This is about family in general. This is about mother and father and wife and husband or brother or sister not coming before the Lord. This won't be on the screen, just these are familiar verses for many of us. Luke 14, Luke writes, "Now great crowds accompanied Jesus, and he turned to them and said," notice that a lot of people are following Jesus, and he's like, hey, I'm not trying to build followers. I'm not trying to get to a certain amount of likes on my, social media page. Why are you actually following me? Then he says this, "If anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, even his own life, he cannot be my disciple." He doesn't go, you can't be an elder in a church or a pastor. You can't even get in. You can't be a Christian at all. If there's anyone in your life that you love more than me, and all his examples are people that we would naturally gravitate toward putting first. Mom, dad, son, daughter, brother, sister, spouse. He says, even yourself. "Whoever does not bear his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple." Then verse 33 says, "So therefore any one of you who does not renounce all that he has cannot be my disciple." One more example is Mark 10. Peter, in one of his moments of, self-confidence, suppose, verse 28 of Mark 10, Peter began to say to Jesus, "See, we have left everything and followed you." Like what you taught over there about everybody hating mother and father in comparison to you. Jesus doesn't mean literally hate your mother and father. It just means in comparison, you got to choose one or the other. You choose Christ every time because your love for him and devotion for him is so singular. So Peter says, look, we've done that. We have left everything and we followed you. And Jesus said, "Truly I say to you, there is no one who has left house or brothers or sister or mother or father or children or your land for my sake and for the gospel, who will not receive 100-fold now in this time houses and brothers and sisters and mothers and children and lands with persecutions, and in the age to come eternal life. But many who are first will be last, and the last first." Jesus is saying it hurts to follow Christ, and sometimes having to not sometimes, but to always prioritize him over all else, sometimes means the loss of those relationships. If mother or father or brother or sister or spouse hate Christ and you love Christ, they might be out. And he goes, but you gain much more. You gain other brothers and mothers and fathers and sisters. What is he talking about? He's talking about the family of Christ. That the church is your primary family. Now, Jesus isn't saying dump your family and just go to church. He's just saying sometimes bearing your cross means your kid does hate you. And if you think that your devotion to Christ means your kid is going to hate you, what do? That's the choice. Or your spouse, or your father. You can keep going, your boss, your roommate, your coach. It doesn't matter. Christ has to be your ultimate devotion, and sometimes that's going to hurt to keep him first. Ultimately, we follow Christ to the most extreme devotion and to the highest point of excitement, the highest priority, not because we drum it up, but because it extends and stems from his extreme demonstration of love first. God demonstrated the greatest act of love, that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. That's extreme. But he did it first, and then invites us into that extreme love. So we don't do it to earn something out of God. We do it because we are grateful that he's already demonstrated this radical, extreme devotion to the bride of Christ by sacrificing Jesus on our behalf. Jesus willingly giving himself up and enduring pain and torture so that we can have life with the Father. And so in that real way, God is inviting us into a relationship where the privilege of having a son or a daughter is not the privilege of having that son be number one in your life, but that relationship between father or mother and child reminds us of the first relationship between us and God. It is a picture of the greatest thing. It is not the greatest thing. It is probably the greatest picture of the greatest thing. But our relationship with the Father through the Son, Jesus Christ, is primary and number one. And we need to align our commitments, our time, our lives to make sure that Christ is over all. Let's pray.